So can you both talk a bit more about the writing process? Writing is often a very sort of solitary action that we all do. And this is the book you wrote together. So I would love to know how you did that. Are there like some chapters that are someone else, or one person, some the other, everything together? What was the process there?
So, do you want to start?
No, go ahead.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll start. Stobo approached me and he had a significant chunk of manuscript that was already written. And so when I came, he asked me, can you keep going forward with it? Can you keep carrying on the theme? So I then added more. And then we basically had something like 18 or 19 chapters of book, more or less what you see before you in some form. And then Stobo divided everything into chapters on Google Docs. And this was during the pandemic, right? So we're like Zooming with each other every night, and we're collaborating via these electronic documents night after night. And what we did was after we had a complete thing, we then went back to the beginning and we took turns reading chapters, and we would rewrite chapters, and we would find, like some paragraph where I think like it's not right still. And so I would cross it out and I would write 3 different versions of that paragraph and say, Stobo, which of these works for you, or maybe something different. And so every morning we would wake up to a set of assignments, more or less, that were left to us by co-authors. And in that way, over time, because when we go back and do this over and over and over again, it becomes very difficult to know who wrote what by the end of it. I think there's 2 sentences that I'm sure one of mine is mine and one of which is Stobo's for sure. But after that, it really, like I tell people, like, when I write an academic article, I send it off and it comes back with, suggested revisions, and I hit accept all, and then I never look back. But that is not the way Stobo writes. So there's probably been about 150 redrafts of the book. It's over and over and over again. And I'll just talk a little bit about what that is about. That's about the fact that we're similar, but we're not the same. And we come to see the words as having different kinds of meanings. Like we bring our own baggage to just the words on the page. And so an example of that is very early on, somewhere in the first couple of chapters, there's a line about, it started by saying, lands that these indigenous peoples once called their own. And I was like, dude, not cool. Like, they owned the land. It was their land. And so I rewrote it a couple times. And so it came back, okay, I get it. The thing is, people who don't agree with us have to get past this page, right? They have to like see the book, they have to see themselves in the narrative. And if we're like in their face now, we're gonna lose them. And so we argued about that for a while. And then eventually we landed on a sentence again, rewrote it again and again and again. And it ended up being something very much like lands these nations once governed as their own, right? Which captured for me this idea of governance, of ownership, but also this idea of a break with the past. And so to the extent that it reads well, it's because every word has been hewn down from one side or the other as we try and find that middle ground that represents a truly indigenous view, a truly settler view, and is able to use words to find that middle road. And that was probably the hardest part is, you really get to know someone when you're having these kinds of discussions day after day. So let's say,
yeah. I think to be a good writing team, it's kind of like a loving partnership where
I've been divorced twice.
We'll see if we write another book.
Understand the magnitude of the scope of the project.
I love Douglas and I want to write another book with him. But I wanted to say that when we sold the manuscript, which didn't happen until like 4 years into the process, the editor, he said something like, and then so you sell a sample and a proposal, and then we send in the whole manuscript a couple of months later, and the guy was like, same as Jim, he's a super nice guy, and he's like, this is the best first draft I've ever seen. And I was like, that's not the first draft, dude. That's the 150th draft. So his job was very easy. We did all the suffering first. And I think I want to give one more really concrete example where it was not always easy, but I think the truth is that because we are different and because we're coming from different places, Douglas felt things more strongly that I just didn't feel. And there was a chapter, I think it's chapter 2, where we're talking about Linda, who's at a residential school. And I think I wrote an early draft which used a word which I can't even say out loud anymore. Frankly, it's SAVAGE. I used that word like a bunch, like maybe a half dozen times in a couple draft pages. And Douglas was like, I think he kind of like winced visibly. And I could tell that like, yeah, I didn't get what that word meant. And he said something like, we can use this word, but only when we absolutely must use this word. And I think it appears one time. And I think the whole book was a process like that, where we would just be rereading each other's stuff and try to not soften the edges, but to try to find a language that respected where both of us were feeling, to try to respect where the reader would be coming from.
I'll just say the very best line in the book was written by Stobo. And it's powerful when you come across it. I'm not going to ruin anything by telling you now. And the line is, ha, ha, ha. And then we argued for 2 hours about how to punctuate it. Are there commas, are there periods, are there an exclamation mark? So yeah, a lot of late nights.
Thank you for that. I'm always so fascinated when people write books together. That's just a real
They usually don't get published. They don't make it. Yeah.
There's a real window. So this book, I think, is so compelling because you're telling two real stories. And I mean, that make one bigger story, but you really go into these two families' lives. And that must have taken a lot of trust. So it'd be interesting, I think, to talk about the relationships that you have sort of with the families and the differences there, because I think that really goes to what the heart of the book is.
Yeah. You may not be surprised to learn that it's not like I from Montreal could just drop into a reserve in Manitoba and people would spill their life story to me. That's not how it works. And it took years to get people to open up. And so the way it began was where I think a lot of things begin, which is just going and hanging out with people. And in my case, it was just going to the school, Waiwasi-Capo Community School, and just hanging out and meeting the teachers and seeing who wanted to talk. And I met Maureen Two Voice, who ends up being, she wrote an absolutely magnificent afterword to the book. Many people have come up and say that's the best part of the book, and I think they may be right. And her mom, Linda, is a survivor of residential school in the way Maureen is a survivor as well. And Linda took, more time to get to know. And I think in Rossburn, it also was difficult because people in Rossburn are worried that you're just going to portray them as a bunch of racist rednecks, which isn't fair to them either. And so on one side, you have a long history of exploitation and misrepresentation. On the other, in a very conservative town, there's also worry. So it takes years of talking to people, and first it's sitting down and sharing meals with them and hanging out with their families, and it's years of phone calls, and over time they share more and more and more, and there's like a stack of 14 notebooks filled with verbatim conversations. And Douglas and I decided very late in the process, I think as a sign of respect for what they offered us in this book, to share the manuscripts with them. Not the whole book, but the part that's about them. And that's true, I think it was of Maureen, Linda, Nelson, and Troy. They're the four main living characters. And that's terrifying. If there's any journalists in the room or writers in the room or researchers in the room, because they could say, we don't like it. You got to take it out. And the book just collapses if that's true. But we wanted to show them the respect that I think they deserved. And so everyone read it and no one took anything out. They corrected a few things and they added some stuff. But for the most part, they thought, thanks for doing this well. And here's how you can do it better. And even today, if when I talk to Maureen, she still says, people are coming up to me saying, first, can I give you a hug? And secondly, thank you. Thanks for sharing your story. You and your mom have been so brave. And that's the ultimate, I think, way of showing that we were accountable to them, or at least I think we were accountable to them in the telling the story, that they feel like it was true and they feel good about being a part of it, using their real names. And they had the choice of not using their real names, by the way, but they did. And as you'll see, they're not perfect people. And they've cracked open their lives for all of us. And I think all of them are inspiring in their own way. Sorry for rattling on a bit there.
So what is the relationship with the community like now that the books come out? So it sounds like you have these close relationships with these individuals, but you really do delve into the history of these two communities. Has there been, what has the feedback been?
So there's actually been some really positive feedback. So let me just set out a bit of a story about what happens, and originally what interested Stobo in these towns. And that was that back in 2010, something kind of amazing happens. The book focuses largely on education, although education is just a proxy for all kinds of other issues. And through an initiative between the reserve and the town schools, somehow they convinced the federal government to contribute to the reserve school equivalent funding as the provincial schools were getting. And then the provincial school district, or the local school district, and the reserve school joined team into it, so now they're a single district. The reserve school pays money into the shared services so that they now have access to a speech pathologist and they share all of their services. And it turns out that children now from the town of Rossburn attend some classes, some like woodworking and stuff, on reserve. So we think it's the only place in Canada where non-Indian kids go to school on reserve, even part-time. And that meant that all of a sudden, everyone was coming into contact with one another, but under conditions of vague equality. And what had happened before was, because of the underfunding, the reserve school kids would finish grade 6, they'd cross the river to go to grade 7, they'd experience incredible racism, and they would be so unprepared, and they'd fail out. What happens eventually is that, just because of economics and farms consolidation, is the town realizes that they're running out of kids. Like, they're going to have to close schools. All the local kids are moving away. But across the river, they see like, oh my God, there's this huge burgeoning population of kids. If only we could somehow get them to come to our schools prepared, then we wouldn't have to fire people. We could keep our schools open. And so the motivation to come to this agreement, it wasn't like everyone's like, I'm finally going to address injustice. It was self-motivated. It was about self-interest. And there's a lesson there. I think there's a couple of lessons possible there. The answer ultimately is not that equal funding is the answer. Right? The answer, I think, is closer to, well, we'll talk more about that later. But now that the kids are seeing each other under conditions of equality, parents are running into each other, and their children are attending schools under similar conditions, lots of stuff has begun to change in that town, stuff well beyond the school itself. And I'll let Stobo talk about some of that.
Yeah, thanks, Douglas. I want to say two things. One of them is about the reception in Rossburn. And someone wrote us maybe 2 months ago to say there was a very long message, and that's one of the coolest things about writing a book is that people like send really long messages about what it meant to them, and it's really cool. And one person said, Rossburn will never be the same again after this book. And that meant, that was in a good way. because people are starting to have conversations in their families, among their friends, and starting to hear the stories in the other community. And it goes both ways. Like the young woman, Maureen Tuvois, who's the main character of the story, it wasn't until she was like in her mid-20s that she started learning about the history of Ukrainian Canadians and how there were some echoes of the past system, which is a system that turned reserves into prisons effectively, where people needed federal permission from federal agents to leave the reserve. She was interested to learn that Ukrainians were interned during World War I because Ukraine was allied with the Axis. And there were all kinds of racism that Ukrainian Canadians faced when they came to Canada. And in British Columbia, in fact, there was, one of the main internment centers. And I think the picture in the book of a bunch of white folks interned behind barbed wire was in British Columbia. And so people in Wayway are learning about Rossburn, and people in Rossburn are learning a lot about Wayway.
Tell them what the flag.
Yeah, and I'll tell you like a late breaking development, which I think it's an overall hopeful story. Yeah, I mean,
it's cool.
So first of all, Wayway Sikapo decides unprompted to put up a Ukrainian flag near their band office, which is really cool. And they also own a gas station near Brandon, Manitoba. I'd also noticed a Ukrainian flag there. The city council in Rossburn, since this book was published, has met with the band council of Wayway Sikapo for the first time, I think, ever, just to talk about their shared interests. And they decided, hey, let's put up a Treaty 4 flag in the town. Because there's this little park which has a flag of Manitoba and of Canada and a veterans related flag. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there because a person from Rossburn, who's a very conservative, cranky person who happens to be in the book, he, in the dark of night, sneaks out and he lowers the flag, steals the Treaty 4 flag. It's a small town, so everyone knows who did it. And the city council goes to this guy and they're like, give the flag back, dude. And he won't do it. And so they enlist the town librarian as like a mediator. And she goes and she gets the flag back without violence. And right now the plan is to put the flag back up, which is good, but they still haven't figured out a way to like keep it up. So I'll keep you posted on how it's going. But that, I think, the fact that the town felt the need to respond that way and that Wayway put up the Ukrainian flag, I think those are beautiful, small things.
Yeah. And they didn't go like, oh, well, that guy's pissed off. They took it down and they respected the fact that he's pissed off. They're putting together a plan to respect his concerns, but to get it back up. So it's like, to me, it's one of the most hopeful examples because it's both sides trying, they run into a bump, and then they're gonna keep trying, and that's what it's gonna take in the end.
So something you said, Douglas, that I noticed when I was reading the book was about the path to reconciliation and self-interest. Mm-hmm. And it's, I feel like you sell reconciliation in the book, not because it's the right thing to do, but because this is the path forward. And I thought that was interesting to focus there on this is the best thing for us to do because of for all of us as Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And I wanted to know more about that. And was that a conscious choice? And
yes, thank you, Emily. So, so you get to the part where there's the equalized funding, and then you read through the chapter, and it turns out, wow, look at those kids. They're doing so much better. And, so there's an opportunity now where we could just go like, and problem solved. Good night, everyone. Thank you for reading. But, we came to realize that equal funding is vulnerable. Right. The reason it's unequal now is because people decided to make it unequal, and they can make it unequal again in the future. And so none of these problems we've come to realize are going to be solved through funding. Funding is not the problem. The problem is that Indigenous communities don't have access to the land and resources that they need to raise the money to spend on their communities. Governments tax, that's what they do. They tax people and resources, and they spend that money on their citizens. They build roads and hospitals, and that happens at every level of government, except on an Indian reserve. Indians don't have taxation capacities for the most part, which means they're more or less legislatively prohibited from raising their own monies. We know that in a world where Indigenous parents sitting on school councils in Indigenous communities, they're not going to screw their children over. They're going to fund them right. And that's the answer. That's how you fix clean running water. That's how you fix child welfare, is you let the people in those communities have access to the resources that they need to do that. And not the money. It's not about federal transit. You can't keep doing that. We have to empower communities. And part of what we want to point out in chapter 18 is we want to be honest. And I think that Indigenous scholars and academics, we just stand there and we're right, justice, let our land back, which is awesome. But we have to realize we're asking other people to sacrifice. And justifiably, right? There have been injustices. But nevertheless, without acknowledging that we're part of this shared project, and that in asking people to make better the lives of Indigenous people, that is going to impose a cost. And we want to face that reality. I don't think that we can ultimately get to a position of political change where we ignore the fact that 95% of the population is being asked to do something it may not want to do. So part of what we do in chapter 18 is set out how a series of principles that we already agree to, that are already constitutionally in place, something called the equalization formula, which is a constitutional commitment to equal delivery of services everywhere in Canada, so that poor provinces deliver healthcare at the same level as rich provinces. Go to Prince Edward Island, you have a heart attack, go to the hospital, you get the same services I do in Toronto. And that's true everywhere in Canada, except on Indian reserves. They're completely left out of the formula. And that's just a policy choice that we've made. So what we're trying to say is that we have in place all of these ideas of federalism, these fiscal structures, these ideas around taxation that we're already doing. And what we're suggesting is that there's a way to bring Indigenous people into that economic confederation in a way that is shared throughout the country, so that we're not overburdening any particular population by asking them to do the right thing.
Thank you. I loved the tax section, the last chapter, but that's stuff I'm really interested in. So I thought it was really fantastic. Were there things when you were doing the research for this book that surprised you? Because I know coming into it, practicing law in this space, I assume I know a lot of things about this history, and I was very surprised by the Ukrainian internment camps. I was surprised with some of the details about the past system that I hadn't known about before. So did you find anything out, and what was the most surprising?
I think one of the things that surprised me was that you could just email and call former deputy ministers who are still alive, who were in charge of Indian affairs, as it was then called, in the 1980s and 1990s. And they would say to your face, on the record, yeah, we knew kids on reserve were getting way, way less, and it was wrong. We knew. And that's disgusting. It wasn't like some accidental thing. And it's not like they felt good about it, but they were just like, that was just the way it was. Like you're around the cabinet table, the Minister of Indian Affairs never was the one who got the most money. And I think for me, that was the thing that kept tugging and pulling me along to do the work of this book, is that a lot of this book happened before I was born, but a lot of it is in our lifetimes. And I think there's still this sense that the really bad stuff happened a long time ago. And this is like, there wasn't even roughly equal education funding until like last year. And we could talk more about whether that's an appropriate amount now and what equality would really mean. But that's like the last 40 years has been appallingly less. And that was surprising for me to just find how obvious it was for the people doing it. And I also agree with you, Emilie, that I kind of had vague ideas about things like the pass system, but we try to show you, and really there's a picture. We wanted people to see a picture of what a pass looked like. And I urge you to take a look at that picture carefully, because it's a picture of a pass that a father needed in the late 1890s to go visit his son at a residential school. And what that tells you is that the government didn't want parents to visit their kids at residential schools, and a lot of parents didn't get those passes. And there's the official in charge of it said, you know what? We did a really good job keeping parents away from their kids of late. You know, aren't we doing this well? So the details are shocking, even when you know things in general, and the contemporary stuff was new and shocking to me.
So one, I think I'd grown up in part of the prairies, and there's Ukrainians everywhere there. It's like part of the background trope of Canada. And I just never stopped to ask why, right? And so in Valley of the Birdtail would tell you why, how that happens. And I think that has actually, that wall of like, I never even asked why. You said something earlier about how much you thought you knew about history. And I think that that is actually a problem that we all have, is that we all think that we know something about history, when in fact, most of us have the history that my son just completed. He finished grade 10 history, so his last mandatory history class. And his report card said, Otis has completed his study of Canadian history. Wow. I think like he like all kinds of people just gonna walk out there thinking they know. And most of us don't know anything. So learning how much I didn't know was, I think, kind of shocking. But really, I think the thing that got to me, the thing that I lost sleep over was, of course, I was familiar with all of these policies. None of them were a surprise to me. I was aware of all of them. But what I hadn't seen really was how they were designed to work together, one building on top of the other, right? Like it's okay to have residential schools, but without keeping the parents away, like that's, you know, that's not gonna work. So you need to do that. And you need to do that in an environment where the farmers are thriving. And that means you need to have systems in place to suppress Indigenous farming, right? So you could have economic policies that would, you know, they put in a railroad close to the town so that the farmers would be able to bring their grains. And then they said, Indigenous people, you can't even have access to modern farming. So just to see like how the policies build together over time, like they're not isolated incidents. It's not like, well, that was a bad policy. It's that was a bad policy that was designed to build on an even worse policy to make outcomes still even worse. And I never really appreciated that it was a system that developed over time, designed interlocking to work one within the other.
So I think a big part of this book, I think, is reconciliation and how we get there. And you know, you propose some really good ideas. But one thing that I noticed you didn't sort of engage with as much, or really was UNDRIP. And I know that that's kind of a recent.
Can you say what that is?
Yes, it's the Indigenous,
United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People.
Yes, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People.
Sorry.
Yeah, and recently that was enacted into legislation in Canada, sort of, I should say, because the legislation, the federal legislation, states that Canada will work on a plan in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples to implement UNDRIP. And they are still in the process, something that I've been working on, of drafting an action plan. And I think that this is going to become an important document. It already is an important document, but I think it will hopefully become a more important document in Canada. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how you think that's going to engage with reconciliation.
Disagree. Yeah, I'm sorry, Emily, but and it's me. This is like a thing that I felt for my whole life, and it's particular to me, I think. But I don't really believe in international law. And why do I not believe in international law? Because international law has no force and effect in Canadian law. It just has no meaning. You can completely ignore it. The rule is that international laws and norms have no legal consequence in Canada until they are supported by legislation from a Canadian parliament that enacts those laws, right? So until Canada, see, we can sign as many UNDRIP agreements as we want. It doesn't mean anything. What is required is for us to develop the legislation to implement it. And that's the part that we're not really doing. And it's just, to me, I think like, this is our problem. Like we broke, let me explain this to you. Like, because this is the thing that has blown my mind. The residential schools, the Indian wars, the long marches, everything bad that happens. It happens after Confederation. Post, pre-1850, most of the treaties are okay. Post 1812, they start to get dodgy. The relations between Indigenous and settler people, between the French and their Indian allies, the British, they're mostly pretty good. Most all of the land on the eastern seaboard, it traces title to a willing Indigenous settler. What's happened since then isn't colonialism, it's us. We wanted a railway. The 13 colonies wanted a country and they took it. So I think that until we face that, until we accept that we're the problem, we're not going to fix this. And I don't think anyone from the United Nations coming and tell us we signed this document, blah, blah, that's not going to motivate people. Right? What's going to motivate people is realizing that we are the ones who are going to, and in fact, international law is going to require us to be the ones who do the change. So I never really, thought of international law as an important instrument in my legal life as an Indigenous person. Although, having said that, so there have been decisions, like the Lovelace decision, which went to the status rights of Indigenous women, did in fact have value, but it's rare. It's rare. And I think that there's not any good reason why we couldn't have come to that conclusion ourselves. And so I think like the right answer is obvious. The idea that someone else is telling us to do it just strikes me as a misstep. And instead, I think we're better off learning our history and realizing that we're the problem, right? That we didn't inherit this. We're the ones who messed it up. It's up to us to fix it. It took us 7 generations to break this thing, and it's going to take us 7 generations to fix it. So let's all stop thinking that there's a quick fix or an easy solution. These are structural problems, and we need to face that. And I think that the only way we can do that is by accepting that we're the ones who have to do it. Sorry, I know that's controversial.
No. I mean, as I said, the UNDRIP Act put in place a plan to make a plan. So, I mean, you're not wrong. It's a lot of busy work for a lot of lawyers and Indigenous individuals to work on a plan that hopefully will do something one day.
Yeah. No. And I do want to acknowledge that Lovelace really did make a big difference. Actually, even within my own family.
Yeah, Lovelace was huge.
Yeah.
So what does reconciliation then mean to you? I know it's very broad, but I think there's a lot of different things in the book.
Can I read something?
Sure.
Will people okay if I read something?
And how are we on time too?
I think we're gonna go till like
7.
Yeah, like we have another 10-15 minutes. Okay, so this may not seem like a direct answer to the question, but I think it says something important about the project of the book. And I think part of the project of the book is to listen attentively to conservative, rural, white people. And that may not seem like a good place to start, but I think it's part of the answer. Because I think what happens when you listen carefully is that you see that there's a coherent worldview that it helps to understand. And I think what you see reading this book and what I saw hanging out with people in Rossford is that people are able to grow and learn and change And I'm not interested in writing off people in places like Rossburn as a bunch of racists who can't learn. And I think there's a key moment in the book, and I'll start reading in a moment, about a man named Nelson, who's in his 70s, who only late in his life starts teaching adult ed on a reserve. And his entire life, basically, he was a guy who went to lunch in the hotel bar in Rossburn, laughing along at racist jokes, knowing zilch about his Indigenous neighbors. And it's only in his 60s that he starts hanging out, spending time on a reserve as a teacher, and he actually has to have actual conversations with people. And his views change. And I think there's a key moment in the book where he says, I was a racist, and I probably still am. I think that second part of the answer is key, and he's starting to do the work. And the passage I want to read to you is a passage about his son. I think I might go with that. About his son, whose name is Troy. And he's a guy who grows up in Rossburn and knows very, very little. And I think the only context you need to know is that there's a residential school in Brandon, Manitoba. And that's where this happens. And Troy is training to be a teacher. So he's at teacher's college. During Troy's first summer in Brandon, Halloween fell on a Sunday. Troy started the night at a house party, drinking Coors Light with a group of classmates. Normally they would have gone to a bar, but bars were closed on Sundays. Someone suggested a trip to the old Indian school, the closest thing Brandon had to a haunted house. Troy and a few others had heard that students had died out there a long time ago, but no one knew how or why. If there are any ghosts, one of friends said, half drunk, half joking, this is like the perfect time to check it out. Yeah, Troy thought, let's do it. They piled into 2 trucks and drove west from the city along Grand Valley Road. And before long, they spotted the silhouette of the abandoned school at the top of a hill. It looked just as spooky as they had hoped. The trucks followed a bumpy gravel driveway that led to the rear of the main building. They arrived around midnight with a generous slice of moon overhead. Troy and his companions headed for the main entrance. They were far from the first visitors to the derelict school, which was surrounded by broken beer bottles. Previous revelers had long since kicked down the flimsy plywood that had once sealed off the entrance. Troy ambled in with a can of beer in his right hand and a second can bulging in his jacket pocket. Inside, bits of plaster and chunks of concrete littered the floor. Each step crunched. There was a lot of damage in there, a lot of smashed walls, a lot of smashed windows, Troy recalls. Moonlight illuminated parts of the building, but otherwise he and his friends found their way using lighters, the flames casting dancing shadows. As they explored, some of the guys started telling scary stories. I heard someone died in this room, one said, eyeing a small windowless chamber. And the basement, that's where they put the morgue. That's where they kept the dead bodies. The group decided to split up and then try to scare each other. Troy headed off alone, squinting as he slowly picked his way through the debris. He paused when he found a room with a gaping hole in the wall, which seemed like a perfect place to stage an ambush. He picked up a piece of concrete from the ground and waited, sipping his beer. When he finally heard a few of his friends approaching, he selected just the right moment to toss his projectile towards them through the hole. The concrete landed with a crash, and his friends yelped like puppies. The rooms and hallways Troy wandered that night were the same rooms and hallways where this awful principal we talked about earlier locked a student in his room without clothes, where students plotted their escape, where a young student was assaulted, who we talked about before. To Troy, though, it was just a creepy old building, a place that time and everyone else had forgotten. With the past muted, All he heard was the crunching underfoot and the occasional screams and peals of laughter when one friend sprung up and shouted, "Boo." Troy cannot recall the topic of residential schools ever coming up during the 2 years he spent at Brandon University's Teachers College. The year he graduated, 1996, was the same year that the last Indian residential school in Canada closed. So this is what we're working with. We're working with people who spent their whole lives next to Indigenous people who knew nothing about them. Their neighbors who know nothing about each other. This, I think, is still where we're at as a country. And Troy learns after this a lot, as you'll see. And I think he's an inspiring person because he knows nothing and is partying like a buffoon. And he becomes someone who is respected and even loved in Wewesi-Kapo. And it's a beautiful story to see. And I think there's lessons for all of us in that. That's a long answer about reconciliation, but I think that's part of the work.
So further, I want to say that what Stobo just read is that's what the book is, right? We talk about, law lurks in the background, we talk about policy a little bit at the end, but it's a book about, it's stories. It's just stories about people's lives. So don't be scared off by law talk. It's just stories. So on the reconciliation thing, I was having lunch with a friend before I came here, and she was mentioning like allyship, like how do we be good allies? And, she actually said to me, she said, I'm tired of being an ally. Like, can't I just be the hero once? And that's like a really risky thing to say out loud, right? But I want to acknowledge that I think in many ways that Stobo, like, it's starting to say, like, acted not as an ally, but like took on the hero role, right? I'm not just going to be a partner. I'm going to start this thing. I'm going to dig in. I'm going to do the work. And then I'll ally up with someone later. So congratulations. So, amazing. I hadn't thought about, I've been thinking about how to describe that role. And I think that's right. Like, you don't always have to be the ally. You can be the hero. Right? You can't do it all by yourself, but you don't have to let me take the lead. I want to say, I made a point about reconciliation just generally. And for our poet friend in the back in particular, we hear a lot about how hard it is. Like, what do we do for reconciliation? How do we get to reconciliation? And I want to get to reconciliation. It's so hard. And I think about why? Why is it so hard? And it is hard. And so one day, very recently, because we were going to go talk to a whole bunch of school teachers, I looked it up in the dictionary. And you know what the most amazing thing I found was? Reconciliation is a noun. It's not a verb. Right? It's like that. It's like trying to get to potato, right? What we should be trying to do is engage in reconciling ourselves to the fact of injustice, reconciling ourselves with the fact of inequality, reconciling ourselves with the fact that we're going to have to act and engage in activities, and we're going to have less sometimes. We have to reconcile. Reconciliation was, I'm beginning to realize, the very worst word we could have used to try and describe what we're doing here. Because it's not about acting. It's about some end feeling, some end state. And in fact, to get there, we have to do stuff. We need to reconcile. And so what do we do as individuals? How do I engage in reconciling? How is that any better? And so, we can talk about allyship, but really, I think the answer about how each of us should think about this, we'll do the India thing and I'll tell you a story. This is a story that was actually in the TRC report, so this is just my version of the story. And it concerns a time here on Mother Earth before there were any human beings. There were just, the four-leggeds and the winged ones and the insect beings and the mushroom beings, the ocean beings. And one day the creator calls an assembly of all the animal beings and assembles them all and explains to them that he's brought them all here because he's going to introduce a new being into this world. He explains that it's not going to be a being like you animal beings. This is a being that is going to be weak and scared and literally born without instinct. Everything that they will need to survive, you will have to teach them. And more to the point, in order to feed them, you will have to sacrifice your flesh. And to keep them warm, you will have to sacrifice your fur, skin. But I will give these beings a special gift. And that's the gift of the knowledge of truth and justice. But a gift that powerful, you can't just give to someone. They'll not see its importance. They won't understand what it is. They'll forget about it. They have to work to get there. But I don't know where to put it. And so one after another, the animals come forward and they raise their paws and wings, and they, so they're like Buffalo says, give it to me and I'll race it way across the prairies. And the creator says, thank you, Buffalo, but that's actually not really that far. And like Sam said, give it to me and I'll take it to the bottom of the ocean and we'll hide it there. Like, well, the ocean's really not that far either, and they're pretty creative. Raven says, give it to me, I'll take it to the moon. And Creator says, this is really hard to believe, but as scared and weak and without instinct as these creatures are, eventually they're going to go all kinds of places. That's not going to work out. One after another, the animals offer up their wisdom, where to put the gift. And it's never the right place. It's finally just before dawn, little mole, this little hand. I know, Creator, I know. And Creator asks, Mole, where should we put the truth? And little mole says, put the secret inside them. That way each of them will have access to it, but each of them has to journey within to find the answer to truth and justice. And that is the answer to how you reconcile. It's not up to me, and it's not up to anyone here except you. Each of us has to do the work internally. We have to bring ourselves to a state where we can reconcile the fact of injustice, reconcile the fact of equality, reconcile what it means for me to address those things. And I think that's the answer to what it is each of us has to do.